This game is shit.
Well, conveniently for us, so is this video. Hello everyone, I'm Synth and I've been critiquing Borderlands 3 for a bit now. I'm a video essay channel and this video is a first for me. I came across it while I worked about 3 weeks back, and even though I agree with some points, this video is horrendous. So much so that I felt the need to explain why. So Caption, and fans of Caption, if you're watching, welcome. Now I know the Caption doesn't take criticism too well, in fact he has nuked a past channel for it. But everyone can grow, and Caption, I like your Borderlands 2 video. You got some things wrong, but it was decently made. It was pretty good, but this video, right here, is a nightmare. I'm not here to be an asshole, but I give what I get, and I would like to see your content improve. So I will do my best to be fair to you as we go through this minute by minute. And I will leave the link to Caption's video down below so you guys can follow along, or just to have it so you know I'm telling the truth.
This game, it's enemies, it's levels, it's shooting, it's bosses. This game is so amazing in a terrible way. This is a game where you walk around and shoot at guys who just sit there and shoot back at you, and maybe they have like one ability, and you have like one ability, and there's movement options that don't matter, and it's just fucking... This game is just something. I'm almost at a loss for words. It's like almost every part of it is bad. It's just awful.
I agree with you, except the bit about shooting and jumping and using abilities being a criticism. That's what Borderlands revolves around entirely. I'm curious how you'll explain your point, and hopefully not by stating the same one 15 times, because that'd be silly.
This game is just bad. It is actually nothing more than just jumping around, shooting bullets at a bunch of guys who shoot bullets at you, who may have one or two abilities that you don't care about, shooting at bosses who literally can be beaten by walking sideways to get gear. I don't even really know how to introduce it. This game is just bad. It's a shooter where the shooting is boring and where all the enemy designs are bad, where the bosses are fucking abysmal and everything is too easy, and it just sucks, except for sort of one thing. The only thing I liked about this game was the end game. However, we will talk about all of that later, so for now we're just gonna say fuck it and skip the pleasantries and just get into it.
Yes, shooters require you to jump and shoot. That's really what they are. The bosses are horrendous though, outside of Rampager, Grave Ward, and Agonizer. That I can agree with you on. And I can agree with the endgame being the best part about the game. In fact, in the part 2 of my critique, that was one of my favorite things about the game. Something that was very finely crafted in an otherwise shoddy product.
I have no idea what to actually say. I really don't. The problem with Borderlands 3 is that each thing that's wrong with it leads into like 3 more things that are wrong with it. For example, the combat. I have no idea what to even say about the combat. The combat in Borderlands is literally made up of some of the most useless options in the world, where you just end up running around shooting bullets at people.
Why yes, you do shoot in a shooter. And you can jump too. And slide. And shoot.
There are basically like 7 things that you can do in Borderlands, and this makes up the core combat. You can shoot your gun, jump, run, slide, slam, use an ability or two, melee attack, and mantle. I say that this is a game where you just end up running around shooting people because it is. Or more accurately, it's a game where you end up jumping around and shooting people. But let's talk about that.
So you have a problem with a looter shooter where you shoot people. Maybe I'm being facetious or I just don't understand, but complaining in a looter shooter about having to shoot people seems, I don't know, silly? But I'll be fair and let's see where he's going with this.
So entirely independent of everything else, what is the combat of Borderlands 3 like? Well, again, half of these things you do barely matter or outright don't really at all. The game comes out as you just running around shooting bullets at people.
For those keeping track, this is the 4th time in almost 3 minutes he is bringing up shooting in a shooter. This is why you proofread your scripts, friend. Also, I'm curious how you will quantify the movement options not mattering.
You have 2 movement options in the game, jumping and sliding. Neither of them really matter. The point of a movement option in an FPS game is to have the player be able to avoid things like projectiles, or in this game's case, attacks. However, sliding doesn't really avoid anything, and there aren't attacks that care exactly about either of these movement options.
Except you can avoid attacks by sliding, such as the one that you get hit by at 301. And sliding will help the player get to cover for a safe approach to an area, which also performs the same function in things such as Call of Duty. You're sliding to get to cover, or you can be risky and slide towards an opponent to throw them off guard. There's a level of tacticality to it.
You will rarely ever slide in this game. It's almost entirely useless. There are 2 builds I've seen that actually care about sliding. It's almost like this entire option exists to service an item that makes sliding better.
Maybe in your playstyle you don't slide much, but other people do. Personally, everyone that I have played the game with and watched on YouTube uses sliding, albeit some less than others. And while yes, sliding is good for Zane and Mara, the mechanic can be utilized by anyone on any class for a number of reasons. Sliding into opponents in Borderlands 3 also stunned them, so there's a tactical use to it.
There are no parts of levels or any enemy attacks that you should really slide under, except for on one boss. And in the case of levels, there are very rarely ever examples of places that you can even slide under. Enemy attacks don't really care about these movement options. There aren't attacks that you're supposed to dodge either with jumping or with sliding specifically, because all the enemies are kind of shit.
I agree. In some areas, there are rarely ever anything that you can slide under, and if Gearbox are going to add this in the game, then they should have designed some areas to play around it. But many bosses' attacks can be slidden under or away from, such as Grave Ward's arm strikes, the chainsaw from Agonizer, and under some of Tyrene's attacks. You can also slide under some projectiles in common enemy attacks, and it does help the player to take less damage, even if that effect isn't so obvious.
You can sort of haphazardly jump around and try to avoid attacks, but there isn't any specific application of these movement options to avoid things.
You already said there was one example in your own words. Well, I'm sure you didn't go more in depth with it because that would destroy the narrative.
You just sort of jump around, and again, you really never slide to try and avoid things, and it generally works for most attacks, except for all of the attacks which you cannot avoid, which is like 50% of them.
Will I rarely ever use sliding since it's useless? Or is it because in your own words, 50% of attacks can't be dodged, meaning that 50% can? So which is it? Because 50% isn't rare by any means, and that in itself still justifies sliding. And I remember in a little video that you made about Borderlands 2 that you wanted more movement options, unless you went back on it.
But I really think movement needs more options. Sprinting is bad, so just get rid of it. Put something else in its place, like a dash, a double jump, a wall run, a climb, a vault, anything. That's how it should be, if you ask me. Sliding is, again, almost entirely pointless, and I don't even really want to spend much time talking about it.
Whew, I thought you'd never say it, because that was embarrassing. I know my videos aren't great, but good god, man, at least when I'm making an argument I don't defeat myself within a few sentences.
In my entire playthrough of the game, I only ever started sliding towards the end of it, and that was only because it gave you a small burst of speed. There were 2 attacks, I believe, that I was supposed to slide under among all of the bosses in the whole game. Again, this game doesn't designate certain enemy attacks for certain movement options, which is a problem with the enemies that we'll get into later.
You figured out that using sliding was viable at the very end of the game, and not any time before that, and you want to designate which attacks you can slide under. Now, I'm no rocket scientist, but usually, if you see an oncoming attack that is at eye level, you can mostly assume that it can either be slidden under or away from. Because with sliding, you can slide away from an attack while not being under it. So I hope you elaborate on that.
So, what else in the combat is there? Well, there's shooting your guns. I say just shooting bullets at a bunch of guys to describe this game's combat because that's basically what it is, to put it bluntly.
Nope, no elaboration on that, and he's on the shooting at people thing again. This is the 5th time. And yes, I'll be keeping track, it's funny. And yeah, that is pretty damn blunt. Following this part, he summarizes and lightly breaks down how the guns are generated, so we'll go to his next point since he'll be returning to that in a little bit.
Slam is an entirely pointless attack that is highly limited, boring, and useless. Following the trend of useless stuff the player can do, in Borderlands 3, if the player gets higher than jump height into the air, they can crouch to do a slam attack. This is your only attack outside of shooting, abilities, and melee, and it sucks. Because the player can't do the attack at jumping height, they can't entirely control when they do it. It's limited by the available map because the player needs some kind of thing to mantle onto to perform the attack, making it suck.
I agree with you. While slamming is a nice option to have, not a lot of areas make it worthwhile to use. It's more situational. But while you and I may not use it, that doesn't mean that others don't. Though definitely could have used more depth.
Plus the fact that most enemies are shooting guns at range means that unless an enemy is near something, you can't even do it to them. Not that you ever would do it, because all it does is a moderate amount of stagger damage and barely any actual damage, assuming you don't have a good artifact for it, which nobody ever does because Victory Rush or Splattergun are usually just better, making it almost entirely pointless.
You know, it would really help if when using specific info, you use the right thing. Victory Rush has a perk called Another One. Killing a badass gives movement speed and damage while active, and Splattergun gives increased shotgun damage while sliding. It took me 30 seconds to double check that on the wiki. So I don't know if you think your fans are ignorant or what the deal is, but that's a very embarrassing mistake to make. Please caption, please proofread your script. Plus, if we're talking about Splattergun, then it only works when you're sliding, and since you already said that you don't do it yourself, I guess there's no point for you to be using that either way.
I don't get why they made this so useless. It would only make the game more fun if you could do this at will, because that would open up your artifacts for slamming as being actually somewhat useful.
Fun is subjective, and seeing as how you never once state that this is all your opinion, I'm inclined to tell you that bringing up fun is a moot point. There's no way to measure someone's level of fun and compare it to others. My fun and Bill Cosby's fun probably isn't the same. At least I hope not. But I do agree with you that slamming is useless.
Slamming doesn't get bonus damage off of gun effects or skills, so it wouldn't end up being overpowered or broken, because it cannot hold a candle to shooting. The player can also use melee attacks, but I barely should even mention this because all they do is a tiny amount of damage outside of the sirens at a short distance. That's it.
Well, yeah. Amara is the character that can be spec'd around melee, just like Krieg and Zero were in Borderlands 2. Yet I don't remember you complaining about that in that video. Funny how that works. In the next portion, he summarizes Zane, and we'll be skipping over this since he'll come back to it later.
There are 4 characters in Borderlands 3, Zane, and then the rest of them. Zane is the only one who gets to have 2 abilities at once, each other character only gets 1. These other abilities are also not made as well as Zane's. Each character gets 3 to choose from, except for the gunner, sort of at least, but they aren't all made as well.
Well yeah, that's what makes Zane unique. Before getting the buffs that he needed, Zane with 2 action skills was a mess. The reason that Zane can equip 2 action skills is because it feeds into Sentinel's tree where every action skill activates all kill skills. It all synergizes. That is Zane's quirk. Giving every character 2 abilities would make Zane stale, and it would be a mess for any team to try and balance. It would also make grenades useless, as that's the sacrifice for having 2 action skills. On paper it's a good idea, but I guarantee you that in action, it would be a disaster. Though I do agree with the point about Moze, but I'll go into that in a little bit.
For example, the Siren's abilities are all basic. She has a directionally fired projectile, a ground pound, and a stun attack. The stun is the most interesting of the 3. Using the projectile literally comes down to finding a bunch of guys in a row, or one big enemy, and using your high damage attack, and then doing it again, and that's it.
Amara is made to be good at mobbing, so her action skills can harm many enemies at once, and augments can further change how her action skill works, such as the one for the slam tree that lets Amara shoot out a giant elemental beam instead. I would say that's an improvement over Maya and Borderlands 2 being stuck with only phase lock. In the few times that I've used phase cast, I have mostly targeted the bigger health enemies, because that just makes sense.
Another example is the gunner, who has just one ability, sort of. Not only to use, but to have in general. She activates a mech that improves her shooting and her health while she's in it, and that's it. It's just a vehicle she gets into, and it makes her shoot better. She can put 2 different weapons onto the mech, but these weapons cannot be recalled or anything, and I don't personally really treat them like unique abilities. Again, this is a shooter, and you want to play around with that. Making a vehicle that just makes shooting better and makes you tougher doesn't really do that.
I agree. More should have been done with Moze, as she's really the only one whose action skills lacks any kind of diversity. While the idea of putting different weapons on her mech is cool, it's too weak to be used efficiently at higher levels. I'm surprised you didn't talk about that. Not only is that a problem, but there's also not enough health for the mech to survive at higher levels. The amount of damage that it takes for how much health it has is very uneven. The mech is definitely going to need more buffs than what Gearbox is given. It's not that viable. It's more of a panic button than an actual tool, and it makes it very underwhelming to use.
Flak is the best runner-up of the remaining 3. Flak has 3 different pets that he can choose from, as well as 3 different abilities. He can only have 1 ability at a time, but he can use his pet's abilities while he has his. The abilities aren't the problem, however.
I agree. Flak is very well made, and again, if every character had 2 abilities, it wouldn't bode well for the game overall. Wait, where are you going with this?
The serious problem with this game is again that the movement doesn't matter. You end up just aimlessly jumping around hoping that you'll avoid attacks because of your jumping. It's almost through happenstance. The game also lacks movement options considering you only have 2 of them. Why doesn't the player have a dash or something that the player can do consistently that allows them to avoid attacks by moving in any of the cardinal directions? Of course, as it is, the enemy's attacks would need to be revamped to care about these movement options, but if they did, they could have attacks you dodge horizontally with a dash, attacks you dodge vertically with a jump, and attacks you could go under with the slide.
6. Jesus fucking Christ. Really? This is where we come back to after that? First off, the slide can be used to dodge in different directions, and second off, a dash would have been interesting as either a character skill or movement option. But seeing as you already don't slide to go under things or avoid them, by sliding left diagonally or right diagonally, and again working off your 50% claim, that still means that half of the attacks are fine as is.
Or maybe allow the player to combine these options to avoid attacks, instead of just having the player jump around trying to avoid these sort of avoidable, poorly hitbox attacks.
What do you mean by bad hitboxes? Can we get an example?
So because of the lack of care these attacks put on your movement options, and the fact that the player only has like 2 of them, the player genuinely does end up just jumping around hoping that by doing so they'll end up avoiding most of the attacks poised at them, using their abilities occasionally and shooting bullets at enemies.
No, I'm guessing no on that one. Also 7. And yes, you can jump around and slide to avoid taking damage. Or just jumping in your case, since it took you a while to figure out how to use slide. And I'm assuming by player, it's an allegory for you personally, right? At least I hope so.
This is instead of running around with movement options that matter, avoiding enemy attacks that are animated well enough that you can care about them and which care about your movement, and firing better guns.
I really hope you quantify that, because so far, the only things you've gotten right were area creation, mows, and slamming. Other than that, this video has been a train wreck and we're just a quarter in. You're treating your opinions like facts, and you're expecting us to just agree with you. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. I hope for my sake, your sake, and the viewer's sake that you start to quantify the things you're saying, with evidence.
You can also use your weapon mods, but again, those often don't give the player new options, so you come back to this combat over and over again, and it's weak. There's nothing else. The player has no options and can barely do anything other than what we've repeated here. There's no other centralized mechanics or good movements, so the game becomes a bore fest where you try to half-heartedly dodge attacks that are coming at you that are animated in a way where you can barely care about them while you shoot your gun at their weak points. Assuming you have to dodge them at all.
I feel like my brain just got hit by a semi-truck. Is it you or me that's having a stroke there with that run-on sentence? You bring up weapon mods, and I'm just gonna interject footage of my second part of the Borderlands 3 critique where I go over all the weapon mods and how they function. To run through all the factions quickly, when you score hits with Jacob's weapons, a bullet will ricochet and hit another enemy, which is a great way to differentiate them from other weapons. All weapons now switch between semi and burst, or burst and automatic fire. Torg weapons can switch between impact and sticky, which again is a great improvement and helps make them more unique. Sticky is a better option for DPS, and normal shells are good for mobbing. Hyperion guns function the same as in Borderlands 2, but some can generate a shield when aiming down sights. Vladoff pistols can switch between full auto and double barrel, which increases fire rate, have a leech which sends out an elemental dot, or have zip rockets. Vladoff snipers can switch to a rocket launchers can switch to mortars, and Vladoff assault rifles can switch to either shotgun or grenade launcher underbarrel attachments. Maliwan weapons can switch between elements, which is handy. COV guns, not SNS or bandit anymore, do not reload and instead have a technically unlimited magazine that corresponds to how much ammo that character can carry. Next up, TDR guns when thrown now either have homing, become a merv, or grow legs and walk around, although they still have a bad reputation. Finally, we have the return of Atlas. All gun types have a version of homing bullets as their ammo switch. With all that being said, how is there no options? Between having multiple ways to use weapons and augment action skills, how are there limited options? If anything, this is more than expanded on Borderlands 2's systems by the sheer amount of different weapons and abilities that we have at our disposal. You said that none of the brands impressed you in the Borderlands 2 video, and I can agree. Yet I doubt that you would even consider saying anything remotely positive about 3. Also, 7.
The abilities outside of Zane's and Flax don't really change this either. They don't give the player enough options to genuinely change the fact that the player is going to run around shooting bullets at guys with attacks that aren't fun to avoid with a bunch of worthless options. What this game needed was not only more movement options, but maybe some other kinds of centralized mechanics that literally weren't just running, jumping, and shooting guns.
You say it again 2 more times. We're up to 9 now. 9 fucking times. The phrase jumping and shooting will give me a new source of PTSD by the end of this video. And please stop using fun. It is not a valid source of criticism.
I appreciate the abilities, but they don't do enough. The ones that are good. I won't knock them. I'm glad some of the characters have the ability to choose between 3 different ones, and I like that Zane's and sort of Flax can be recalled for different effects. But there needed to be more of that. I like the ability modifiers as well, but of course when the player is lacking, it's up to the enemies and the levels to pick up the shooting slack, because the player's abilities are so blank and basic. They need to be generally quite good, and oh boy are they not.
Blank and basic compared to what, Borderlands 2? The only character that's action skill is bland to me would be Moze. The others are unique and all perform functions that synergize with their skill trees, such as Zane's Sentinel and Digiclone with his kill skills, and Amara's Phase Grasp with her elemental damage build. There's more depth revolving skill trees in this game than the former entries in the franchise. Also, no, I didn't cut that last bit off, that was his attempted comedy.
Enemy designs in Borderlands 3 are fucking terrible. So you've already heard some of the things I think about the enemies, so here we go. Enemies in Borderlands are animated poorly, have terrible hitboxes on their attacks, are often poorly designed, which is the most important thing, and have to play with shooting in some way to be any good.
Please quantify anything that you have just said with examples. And they have to play with shooting to be good? Do you mean enemies that shoot at you like the ones you complained about earlier in the video?
Of course, this isn't all that's wrong with them, there's a cavalcade of problems with these enemies. Let's start with the most important one. The enemies attacked in Borderlands 3 are poorly animated, assuming they're dodgeable at all. So much so that you sometimes can't figure out exactly where they're going to go, and therefore can't really care about them. Their hitboxes are bad too. It's hard to tell where an attack is going to hit, and because of the aforementioned inability of the player to move around in a way that matters, you can only sort of avoid them.
This is coming from the same guy who admitted he didn't really use sliding until he got the Tyrene, so I'm inclined to take it with a tablespoon of salt. And examples of these hitboxes and animation issues would be nice, because so far, you've only made baseless claims without backing them up.
Coupled with the fact that none of these attacks are specific in what kind of movement option you're supposed to use to avoid them, they instead become these incredibly poorly animated attacks that just go around and happen, and since it's difficult to figure them out, and that you have no real movement options that matter for them anyway, you just end up jumping around a lot, assuming you need to do anything at all.
You either slide, jump, or use your action skill. That's all. If you see projectiles coming at you, slide left or right. If they're low, jump. Please stop bringing up movement, it's just embarrassing at this point. Also, using the same footage while you make the same point does not help your argument at all.
These were the two things that really needed to happen to make Borderlands more than it is. These were the most important ones. If these attacks were better animated, had clear movement options that each one cared about, and had better hitboxes, the game would have been more about using your movement options to deal with the many different kinds of enemy attacks, instead of just having enemy attacks happen around the place that you can kind of avoid that sometimes hit you.
Citation needed for all of that statement. Also, this guy seems like the movie Bob of game reviews. I don't know why I made that comparison, I just thought it was pretty apt.
You just jump around to avoid things because jumping around just works. It avoids most enemy attacks, not because it's what you're supposed to do. It just kind of works by doing it constantly and haphazardly. Enemies just sort of end up missing. I shouldn't be able to dodge the entire attack of a boss by jumping from side to side, just saying, though it gets worse.
You know that jumping is a movement option to avoid damage, just like sliding is. So if it's working, then it is being used correctly. Obviously, you can jump away from a melee strike to avoid it, and you can jump over some projectiles. You want movement options that matter. Jumping and sliding to avoid damage seems to matter immensely in a shooter.
There are other things wrong with enemies too, for example their designs. Enemies in Borderlands come in two types, and usually have like one attack, not that you will really care, two if you're lucky. These two types of enemies are enemies with abilities and attacks, and the other 60% of enemies which are just guys who shoot at you or who run at you. Mind you that even a lot of the enemies that have abilities are just variations on guys who run at you or who shoot at you. And when I say that 60% of the enemies are just the guy who shoots at you, I mean there is literally one enemy who runs around and sometimes stands completely fucking still who just shoots at you. And that enemy is everywhere. Some enemies will fire projectiles, but again, most enemies are just guys who shoot at you or who run at you, even if they have an ability.
Of course some enemies will shoot at you in a shooter. The fanatics have their own behavior, where they will find cover to shoot at you from, or yes, stand and shoot at you. That is their behavior. They are a trash mob and they are supposed to shoot at the player while the tanks and psychos rush the player. They are supposed to be firing support for other archetypes of enemies. While I agree the COB specifically shows up too much, you don't state that at all. It comes off very ignorant sounding. And again, what did you say earlier, that enemies have to shoot at you to be good? You're defeating your own arguments again.
Most of the time the enemies who have abilities are badasses. Badasses who, while they have an ability which they will use, are still just a bunch of guys who shoot at you. Sometimes they shoot unavoidable bullets, sometimes they shoot projectiles. There's nothing wrong with an enemy who just shoots hit scan, but when 60% of the enemies you face are just the guy who shoots at you, it gets kind of boring, because no amount of movement options will make that matter. On top of that, when they don't fucking move, that's incredibly inept. And boring. As the game goes on, sometimes you find a variation of this enemy that has like one new ability, but that's it, and sometimes that enemy is often then replaced by their old counterpart who doesn't. And it's boring. And one more thing on that while we're here, in an FPS game, an enemy should never, fucking ever, be standing still. They should always be moving. That is the most boring, most incompetent thing ever, and it speaks to the incredible fucking ineptness of this game. In an FPS game, a game where the entire point is to find the trajectory between yourself and an enemy, and to shoot at that trajectory, an enemy should never be standing still. That makes the game as boring as you could possibly make it as far as shooting goes, and the fact that this is happening at all is completely ridiculous.
Yes, they will shoot at you in a shooter. And yes, while badasses have an ability, they don't spam it so that way it's fair for the player. A badass in normal mode and Mayhem 4 are vastly different in that they are a genuine threat in Mayhem 4. Imagine if they did activate their ability more, but usually there are more than one. It's really hard to take you seriously on that when you only jump around, fully admitting that you rarely slide. If there were 3 badasses, spamming their abilities at the player would not bode well for balance. Again, boring and fun are not valid here, they are subjective, and while I agree that there should have been other archetypes of enemies, some enemies standing there to hit scan you is okay. In an FPS looter-shooter that is based on RPG elements, there will be trash mobs, which is what fanatics are, though I can agree that they should move around more, but like I said earlier, they are designed to complement the other enemy types.
Enemies in Borderlands 3 have weak spots, which you can shoot for extra damage, but that's all they do. There aren't attacks that you prevent or change because of these weak spots, because that would be fun, and this is Borderlands 3. Some of these weak spots change slightly, like one causes an enemy to stagger, another causes an enemy to explode after you hit it a certain number of times, but that's it. There needed to be fewer enemies overall, with each one given more attacks and more attention paid to each. Not the same guy who shoots at you 100 times in every level, mixed with a bunch of enemies who you can't care about because of aforementioned reasons.
For this next part, I'm going to do us both a favor and summarize what Caption said. So he says that basically the enemies come down to guys who run and shoot at you, that there are some small variations to them and that's about it, and that all you do is jump and shoot at people. 10 times, he said this. These are enemy archetypes, and you have the ones that sit back and the ones that rush you. This is what they are designed to do, but you still don't provide any examples on the hitboxes or the animations, and the closest we get to that was the Stevie Wonder fanatic. You don't mention other enemies such as Skags, Barkids, and how they were changed and given more attacks. You don't talk about the improvements to the rack, or how the jabbers work, or anything like that. You only go on about the bandits, not ever mentioning how the Maliwan soldiers have great levels of depth to them. You have normal soldiers, rust soldiers, nogs that give bonuses to their friends, and the Maliwan heavies that have one weak spot on their back. They play fantastically well together, yet you don't even try to cover that. Seems a bit disingenuous to me.
If this game had enemies that you could care about, who were actually designed with attacks that were avoidable, that complemented the game's shooting in some way, had fewer of them in every area, that had some kind of design, that cared about your options and had more attacks, which you could pay more attention to, then I wouldn't dislike it as much. But as it stands, bad enemies who don't have a good design, and who don't amount to much, and whom can only sort of be avoided by doing the same thing over and over again, compounded by the fact that you just run around shooting at enemies who just sit still, just sit there, makes this game unenjoyable for me. It makes it boring.
Yet again, you defeat your own argument. Hitting crits on enemies will cause a stagger, stopping an attack in progress. Some will explode. You say that the game needs less enemies, but enemies with more attacks, so why not both? But in the same token, there needs to be different kinds of enemies along with the ones we already have. Adding 3 more kinds of Maliwan enemy and 3 kinds of COV enemy that function differently would have been nice. So I can definitely agree with you there.
As far as boss arenas go, they're mostly empty, and oftentimes they don't have anything to climb on or anything like that. Usually just a big square with some holes on the side that you can fall into, which is slightly disappointing.
We don't need fewer enemies. We do, however, need more depth. This is still an improvement upon Borderlands 2's enemies, however, and again, attacks can be avoided by sliding or jumping away from them. At the beginning of this section, Caption briefly summarizes levels and their lack of depth, and I agree. It would have helped if Gearbox had designed levels with the game's core concepts in mind, and tried to make each one unique. It certainly would have boded well for the game as a whole. Some areas, where you could have slidden under trees on Eden, or maybe slam onto piles of junk to send out shrapnel on Pandora, would have been a very interesting use of these mechanics. Gearbox definitely dropped the ball here.
Bosses in Borderlands 3 are also the worst. They're boring, they basically have no design, and they were easy. They do not elevate the game in any way. They're often so easy that you'll barely ever get hit by any of their attacks, and some of them barely even fight you during their fight, which is just fucking...
I think you missed a major opportunity to really talk about how bad the boss arenas are in this game. There's a whole lot wrong with them. So much, in fact, that I spent about 35 minutes in my critique series talking about them and how poorly made the bosses are. Link to that will be in my description.
Another example of this is Gigamind. Gigamind has attacks. He has attacks that you can shoot down. He's got a shield thing. That's it. All of his attacks are taken from the Nog enemy, but we're not even going to really pay attention to that, because multiple bosses in this game do that. He's actually the boss that didn't attack me for 20% of his fight, by the way, and that's it. He has like 3 attacks, and they throw a bunch of guys into his arena, and that's a fight. Most of those attacks again being taken from another enemy.
Aside from that weird jump cut at the end, I can agree on a subjective level. Fun and difficulty is subjective, so maybe for you and I, Caption, they were easy, but others could have found them challenging in their own ways. So Caption here summarizes Captain Traunt, and I couldn't agree more. This to me is the best part of your video. You summarize Traunt well and what he is without repeating yourself, and it sounds great, man. This is how the entirety of your video should be structured, concise with just enough information to get a clear idea of what you're talking about. Absolutely fantastic. For the purpose of the viewers, I'm not going to play it, but I really do suggest to you guys to go watch this part of the video. I'll put the timestamp in the description, it's absolutely amazing.
Another serious problem some bosses in this game have is that you can deal with multiple of their attacks simply by walking sideways. Agonizer, Troy, and Tyreen all have attacks, and I often mean multiple attacks at once, mind you, that can be beaten by walking sideways. If only we had some movement options, right? It highlights not only the problem with the ease of these bosses, but also the problem with the lack of options in this game. We seriously needed some movement options in this game because otherwise this happens. It not only makes the fight boring, but it makes it easy, and it not only highlights these issues, but creates another where multiple attacks from a boss can be beaten by one option, and that makes it boring. Some bosses barely even have attacks at all.
Agreed. Scaling up of bosses is completely lazy. It is ridiculous that a third of the bosses in this game are used assets with slight variations on attacks, and again, genuinely great summary.
The bosses without the big nameplates, the smaller bosses, sometimes have like one attack and that's it. For example, Mouthpiece, one of the first bosses in the game, has one ability where he becomes immune, and then he shoots at you. His arena also sometimes blows you up if you're near certain walls, but that's it. That's the whole boss. Another smaller boss is the Anointed, a boss who, to his credit, has an attack that you have to jump over, but is also just an enemy with 3 attacks, and he does these 3 attacks over and over again. I also later found out that this is just an enemy called the Anointed Goliath. All these bosses are incredibly easy, too. I never died once from any of them, except for once on Captain Trant when my friends and I played, and on Mayhem 4 a few times, because these bosses are poorly designed.
Yes, some attacks can be avoided by strafing. However, with Troy and Tyreen, Troy has a rock attack that you need to slide to avoid, and Tyreen has a few attacks that can be slidden under or jumped over, such as her giant fireballs and lasers. Odd choices to start highlighting this issue, but I agree that the bosses overall could have used more attacks where heavier importance was placed on sliding and jumping.
I never found any of them to be anything more than cute. Genevieve is a cute boss. She has little walls that you can shoot down, but it doesn't really amount to anything. Kilovolt was similar. He had attacks that you had to jump over, which I appreciated, but again, that's just cute. It doesn't really become a real boss.
While I absolutely agree with you on Mouthpiece, you have to remember he's the second boss in the game, so him being a little simplistic is okay. It's to help new players get into the flow of things. It also sets up the new mechanic of immune phases, so it at least teaches new players something. However, by the time Billy shows up, the formula for these bosses should have been changed, and the difficulty should have progressed further on in the game with more mechanics that make the player commit to a movement option.
This is a boss rush game where the actual act of fighting bosses is bad, and it's all held up on the building of your character to make it all fun. That is not how this is supposed to be. Fighting a boss should be hard. It should be something that an individual has to use skill to do. Yes, being able to beat them super quick because of your character building is fun, but people shouldn't be impressed by someone saying they beat Mayhem 4 Wotan or whomever just because of how much damage you do. Bosses should care about what you can do, and should be an exemplification of the expression of that skill, and they should provide a good challenge not with their numbers, but with what kind of ways they ask the player to express their skill and their capabilities, and what kind of unique design they have, and in what kind of challenge they provide. This was a part of the game that was really important for Borderlands, because bosses are pretty much all it has, and it didn't do well with that.
Odd way to describe them as cute, as it doesn't really help those watching, but I think we can get what you're saying here. That just because they have 1 or 2 things that are unique about them, it doesn't really make them a mainstay boss. And in that, I completely agree with you. Here he summarizes the bosses in the game and why bad boss designs in a boss rush game is a horrendous thing. Caption, that was an amazing deconstruction, except for when you said jump and shoot for the now 11th time. Other than that, I absolutely agree that Borderlands is as engaging as its bosses are, and I think that for myself and many others, that it is a leading factor of why Borderlands 3 doesn't resonate with them. It has a lack of engagement and a lack of motivation that makes you want to keep coming back to farm. So I'm actually just going to let this next part play out as I think it's, again, one of the best parts of the video. It's written very well, and again, good job, Caption.
Before I get into this topic, I want to say that building a character in Borderlands 3 out of these items and skills is fun. Your items have many different effects, or rather, they can have many different effects, most of them being kind of meh. The game randomly generates everything from guns to trinkets to gun effects and anointments, and the most significant effects come from your weapons and your class mod. These effects affect you passively, like skills, which is mostly crap, but they sometimes care about things and change the properties of others, like trinkets that give you fire damage on your slam attack, or more health and so forth. Again, however, most of this is passive, so it doesn't really help the game out much with its option problem.
When you're not repeating yourself every minute, you have proven that you can make a good script. Overall, Caption, your boss's section has me impressed. You have the potential to make incredibly informed videos that are honest. And if you wrote your videos like you wrote your boss section, then I think a lot of folks, myself included, would love to watch more of your stuff. Here he summarizes some things about the inventory before getting started with the stats and items portion of the video.
Some of these properties, however, are kind of nice. For example, there's a shield effect that makes it so that when you crouch, your shield projects out in front of you, reducing incoming damage. This is kind of nice, since this change of properties kind of changes the option you have. However, this is one of the only examples I have. Most effects in this game are still passive and don't really drastically affect your options, but what this game really needed was more activity.
I disagree. Even adding more passive stats for people to mess around with helps leaps and bounds for options. Some relics can add small effects that people want to fill niches in their builds, and anointments add another level of depth to the game. By having specific effects that can be utilized for multiple builds on items, it incentivizes players to farm for the ones they're looking for. It leads to more options and more versatile ways to play these characters. However, this again leads into the problem with bosses, but we've gone over that.
Guns are also made in a similar fashion, however gun effects mostly affect themselves and how they shoot, but like I said earlier, they all just mostly end up in one of the same three categories. These categories being bullets, projectiles, and shockwaves. Most guns, however, are either projectile or bullet weapons, and there are more bullet weapons than there are projectile weapons. Some guns also have weapon mods, and these are hit or miss, mostly missing. Some are good and give you some new options, like the Atlas weapons, which allow you to shoot from around cover or while not looking at the boss, and some are not as good, like the Vladof mods. For example, some Vladof mods give you a different projectile to fire, which is good, however some others just make it so you shoot faster, which is not as good. The real problem is that they don't really give the player enough new options. Instead of gun mods, there should have been gun abilities or something, or maybe just that gun mods should have been better designed. Some guns don't even have mods, so they don't do anything at all beyond just shooting. Weapon mods should have been some kind of activated ability. Have like 10 to 15 different activated abilities or whatever that guns can have, and just randomize which one each gun gets. Have skills that actually care about these instead of what we do have.
It seems Gearbox has further taken inspiration from RPGs in the sense that they have tacked on more passive stats. For Borderlands, that's not a bad thing. The game has always been centered around RPG mechanics. But Gear hasn't really ever decided on how you play the game, outside of making maybe a challenge run or a specific weapon build, such as in Borderlands 2, with Gunzerker pistol build or Zero's sniper builds, or as in Borderlands 3 with Zane's cryo build. The game has always centered around the characters changing how you play the game, not the weapons. The weapons were always there to be utilized however the player saw fit. The builds, the skill trees, now that's where you find the activity. And in this game, the augments you have can now further change and influence different playstyles.
Another problem with the weapons is their inconsistency. You could find a great gun with a mod you prefer, and have to throw it away after 30 minutes to get a better gun. Inversely, you could also get stuck with a bad gun that you don't like for a long time. I know what people are going to say, that's just the nature of the genre, you can't expect to hold on to your weapons. And while that is true, I think it's only partially true. I don't see why we couldn't have some kind of consistency with holding onto guns. Here's an easy solution, allow the player to have a few limited upgrades for their weapons. This allows players to keep their guns somewhat consistent while still allowing them and forcing them to find an upgrade just a bit later down the line. Of course, this doesn't apply to legendary weapons because those are already consistent.
We've already been down this road, so I'm just going to speed this up.
To run through all the factions quickly, when you score hits with Jacob's weapons, a bullet will ricochet and hit another enemy, which is a great way to differentiate them from other weapons. All weapons now switch between semi and burst, or burst and automatic fire. Torg weapons can switch between impact and sticky, which again is a great improvement and helps make them more unique. Sticky is a better option for DPS, and normal shells are good for mobbing. Hyperion guns function the same as in Borderlands 2, but some can generate a shield when aiming down sights. Vladof pistols can switch between full auto and double barrel, which increases fire rate, have a leech which sends out an elemental dot, or have zip rockets. Vladof snipers can switch to a rocket launchers can switch to mortars, and Vladof assault rifles can switch to either shotgun or grenade launcher underbarrel attachments. Maliwan weapons can switch between elements, which is handy. COV guns, not S&S or bandit anymore, do not reload and instead have a technically unlimited magazine that corresponds to how much ammo that character can carry. Next up, TDR guns when thrown now either have homing, become a merv, or grow legs and walk around, although they still have a bad reputation. Finally, we have the return of Atlas. All gun types have a version of homing bullets as their ammo switch.
Having 3 subcategories for weapons to fall into makes them more unique as well, and leads to more generation opportunities, and I can agree that Shockwave and E-Tech need to spawn more. However, Vladof mods specialize in mobbing, which is pretty damn useful. I agree that the underbarrel fire rate increase is pretty mediocre. I completely disagree that there aren't enough options. These are the widest we have had in a Borderlands game. Each brand now serves a purpose, and some are better than others in situations, but they all balance out. And what do you mean by activated ability? You mean like an action skill for guns? Because that would play horribly if it was on a timer. What we have now works fine, and having skill trees revolve around brands would be terrible. Imagine having perks such as Jacob's weapon damage only instead of the flat-out damage increases. That would make things even worse.
The player has 3 different class pages which they can use to define their characters through upgrades. These pages contain a number of different passive skills that affect their abilities or other parts of their character that give them new attributes or change attributes that they already have. Now the thing I've been talking about most is how the player doesn't have enough options, and especially not enough ones that matter. So remember that when I say the word passive ability, because that's what they are. These skills don't actually give the player new options, which is the major problem. They just give you passively occurring abilities that happen either on their own or which just affect some other option you already have. For example, Zane has skills that improve his speed and shooting after he kills someone, and skills where his gun can launch a grenade as its first shot, but that doesn't give him a new option. The only skills that don't do this are the skills found at the bottom of each page, which usually give you some kind of new option, such as allowing Amara to use her action skills twice, or allowing Zane to activate his kill skills from his action skill, which are both good. But why couldn't they have little activated abilities? Little things like after every 5th passive skill you unlock your next active skill or something. Hell, you could put some movement skills into the game to give the player more movement options or really any options at all. Like, I want to ask a question, but what does the Siren do in this game? I understand why she's fun, she does a lot of damage and in fact she's the best character in the game, but all she does is jump around, shoot her guns, and use her abilities, which are just damage aimed at the enemy.
Yes, Caption, that is the nature of looter shooters, especially ones with random part generation. Having weapon upgrades would be interesting, but in the endgame, purple weapons are rarely ever used. Most people chase the strong legendaries, and if they just happen to get a good purple, then they hang on to it. In Destiny 2, there's a similar idea to this system. Personally, myself and the people that I play with would much rather just go out and get a higher light weapon than try and upgrade the weapons we have. It's just more efficient to do so. There's always a possibility that its intended use, which we could assume is upgrading lower to mid-level items, could have such a high requirement that it would be barely even worth using as well. On paper it's not a bad idea, but it's always about how Gearbox will implement it.
She just shoots her guns, charges up her ability, uses it, and that's it. Those are all of her options.
You mean the augments in the skill trees you seem to have ignored? Like binary system in Zane's skill tree that when you swap places with the clone, it triggers a Cryonova, which incentivizes players to actively keep switching with the clone every few seconds. Since you don't know what Amara does, besides saying jumping and shooting for the 12th time, and just describing how a looter shooter functions, she has 2 augments known as Fracture and Downfall. In this tree, Amara has by default Phase Slam, where she will jump up and slam down, dealing AoE damage. Fracture actively changes that to having fists come out of the ground in a line instead, and Downfall actively adding a giant elemental beam before she slams down.
She has some of the better ability modifiers in the game, but nothing really takes her out of that, and other characters aren't much better. The gunner chick only gets one ability, and it's to make her mech. She just gets to jump and shoot and use her ability, that's it. That's all she does.
13 times. You see, just because you repeat yourself does not make what you're saying come off any less ignorant.
That's all this game is if you pick that character. If you could care more about the enemies in the game rather than just having them be a room full of dudes they throw at you, then using your abilities could be more fun, because you'd have to pay attention to what enemies you use it on. There would be stronger and more well-designed ones instead of a gigantic horde of a bunch of guys who shoot guns at you. But it isn't, and it makes using the abilities less fun as a result. Like, the Siren literally just throws her ability out at the strongest guy, or the biggest group of guys, and that's it for her. And abilities, while I again appreciate them, don't really take you out of that. In a game where I've complained that the player doesn't have enough options, the last thing I wanted to hear was passive skills, because that basically says there aren't going to be any new options, and that this game won't be able to just get over itself, and you're just going to keep jumping and shooting.
14. And again I agree. By them limiting her to a mech, it also limited alternate skill tree options, making her seem very derivative and just basic as a character.
There's also Guardian rank, but we'll get into that later. It's more of the same. Some of these abilities aren't even fun in their changing of the properties of the game. Sometimes it's something completely tiny and unnoticeable, like 6% more gun damage or 4% more reload speed or something similar. That's kind of boring and barely even perceptible. Yes, I guess it does care more about caring about something, and it's what allows you to build your character, but that's sometimes barely in effect at all.
Passive stats in a game that takes from elements from RPGs? Well, I'll be shocked. Not really. And the point about skills and skill trees barely having an effect is so facetious and plain dishonest with your viewers. In fact, those skills are half the reason why you're shredding Grave Ward in the clip you provided. Allow me to read out some of these for the viewers who aren't too familiar with Zane. In Zane's barrier skill tree, we have Confident Competence. Increased gun damage by 35% and accuracy by 33% when shields are active. There's Refreshment. When maxed, it provides 24% lifesteal upon damaging frozen enemies. In Sentinel's tree, there's Playing Dirty. When maxed, killing an enemy has 50% chance to cause the next 5 shots fired by the weapon to be doubled. We have Violent Momentum. When maxed, gives 20% extra gun damage when walking. And in Zane's clone tree, we have Synchronity. Each action skill active gives 20% gun damage when maxed. These all together play a major role in the game. Do not act like they don't. If you truly think they don't, see the difference when you choose to not spend skill points versus when you do.
There are also these ability mods that you can apply to your abilities, which you unlock after certain points in one of the pages. and these affect your abilities in a similar way, but more extremely. These ability augments are the best part of the skill tree, and one of the better parts of the game. They give your abilities new properties, granting the player some desperately needed options or modifications. They affect these properties of your abilities and sometimes give you new options by extension of doing so. For example, Zane can get an augment that makes it so his drone can heal him, or Amara can get an ability that makes it so her action skill can stun multiple enemies in an area around where she hits it. Like, that works most of the time. It gives you some new options, sometimes. Some of them don't, but most of them do. But unfortunately, that doesn't really do enough. It doesn't change the fact that you're still just gonna end up jumping and shooting.
If you know that this is in the game and admit that it is the option you wanted, then why did you even write out this section beforehand? What was the point of all that then? And that's 15 times, and I have a feeling you're going to repeat yourself with that but being at the end of that sentence.
This is the only thing in the last opportunity this game had to give the player some new options. And while it does, it's one of the only ones. This game needed more new options, activated abilities and the like, on their guns, on their skills, or something. Something to get out of the constant jumping and shooting.
Well, we already went over that, and call me an oracle because that is 16 times Mr. Broken Record. You know what, let's play a game. Can you guys guess how many times Caption will say the phrase by the end of this video? And no cheating.
And I don't get why. Why doesn't anything bring you out of this? How are there not more options? More activatable abilities? More anything? They made everything just change the properties of jumping and shooting, and not that it actually did anything other than just have more jumping and shooting.
Except they did add more options and activatable abilities. This whole video, you've shown us new options that Gearbox has added in since Borderlands 2. And please, have some level of self-awareness. This is a shooter. You jump and shoot. You guys know this guy has almost 3,000 subscribers? I can't fucking believe it either.
How do you squander these opportunities 90% of the time? They've got like 400 skills in this game and all of them are just affecting the properties of crap. Things like 11% more gun capacity are good for your character because they increase your damage output, but they aren't good for the game. Though this isn't even the real problem.
Please, Caption. Please tell me what the real problem is.
The real problem is again that everything sucks. The enemies suck, the skills suck to a slightly less degree, the guns suck until you get to legendaries, the shooting sucks, everything just kinda sucks. The major problems with this game are that movement doesn't matter, that enemy designs are bad, and that you just jump around all the time and it sort of avoids everything that comes at you. Nothing can just break the fact that this game is boring because there's nothing to it, and I want to know why. Except I do know why.
You guys see why I'm not going to say anything here? Because it would be me wasting my breath and brain cells. I've watched this video damn near 7 times, and every time I listen to it, it reminds me why I made my channel. To be the opposite of people like this.
You want to know why it's bad? I'll tell you what I think. It's because it's a lot easier to distract people with constant voice acting and stupid bullshit than it is to make a good game. Because I guess none of this important shit matters. Gotta spend all your money on voice actors and cutscenes and other stupid bullshit.
Please tell me you're joking right now. Please don't make yourself look any more ignorant by saying having a story in a game is a bad idea. Please, Caption, I am begging you.
None of the things that should have mattered were important to the people who made this game. It is much more important for them to make a bunch of unskippable bullshit than it is to make a half-decent game. If you can make it so that nobody notices or that nobody cares, you can get away with it because nobody will have noticed or cared. Except I noticed, and I noticed it was shit, and everything in this game was shit.
Big Brain Caption noticed. Don't you worry, ladies and gentlemen, the guy who complained about shooting in a shooter, and that complained about having a story in a game has got our backs. Thank you for looking out for us, you tool.
And I'm sure that most of the people who play this game, most of the Borderlands players who care about their Wotan times and getting good gear, they probably noticed that this game could be better too. That your stupid novelties don't distract from the fact that this game is bad. It's boring, it's easy, it's poorly made. I don't care about any of this other crap. It's a novelty. It's a shroud. I like to call it an illusion.
Besides slightly mocking the Borderlands fanbase, you actually think that the story in a game's a novelty. If you mean that it's unoriginal, then I agree. But if you're saying that it was a small part, then I have to disagree with you. And it's an illusion of what? Because if it's being a decent story, then you've hit a nail on the head.
I hate to tell you guys this, but you're supposed to make the game first, and then spend all your remaining money on all this stupid shit. This is clearly a game with bad priorities. Priorities that were completely the opposite of what they should be. This game's priorities were to make all this dumb voice acting, cutscene playing, story bullshit, and to not actually make the game until later, which they spent about $6 on.
Did you really just argue against having a story in a game again? Like, unironically. Well, with game development, it's 50-50. Sometimes they start working on story first, and sometimes it's the gameplay. Both should always be prioritized, and clearly by the lackluster story, they were not.
Like, you know that boss from earlier that I mentioned very briefly, the Agonizer? That boss was preceded, or I guess presided over, by tons of voice acting from celebrity guest actors Penn and Teller. And the actual boss was almost something I liked. Like, it was within the very vague area of something I liked. It had an attack I had to jump over, an attack I had to crouch under, an attack where you could clearly see what part of the area you were supposed to avoid. All good things, except the boss had like 4 attacks, and all these attacks were slow as hell, so avoiding them was easy. The only time it got, I'm not going to use the word challenging, was at the second phase where it activates multiple of these abilities at once, and even then, it's not that hard. Like, there's something very epitomatic or self-inducing about the idea that a fairly decent idea for a boss, or rather a boss with some decent ideas around it, turned out to be total garbage while a pair of high-cost voice actors clown around it. Just saying, but your stupid incessant voice acting and constant other bullshit don't really hide the fact that your game is boring very well, or that things in it are boring.
Well, besides complaining about Penn and Teller, all I can say is okay, because all of that is entirely subjective. I also don't understand how you chose Agonizer of all bosses to make this point of when Warden, Billy, and Archimedes exist.
I'm so excited that I want to fall asleep.
Well, I'm glad you and me see eye to eye on your video. Oh, you were talking about the game? Oh. Well, this is awkward.
Like, yeah, this second to final boss is incredible. This is definitely worth a succeeding 5-minute cutscene when anyone can beat your boss just by walking slightly side to side, or in a circle, while checking to see if the loot they got while the fight is happening is any good. That screams excitement and engagement. And it's definitely not hubris to have all this with an audio stinger that says that the boss can't be beaten, and then have a bunch of shit play afterwards that looks like it actually had more effort put into it than the actual fucking boss did.
It's okay to have an attack that requires players to walk slightly left. That's fine, so long as other attacks make up for it. In Troy's case, that's debatable. I would hope that the story also had effort put into it.
At least I could see where this boss's attacks were going, but that is empty praise. Like, Troy is ass. The only thing hard about Troy are his immunity phases and the fact that his hitbox isn't big enough to take the best advantage of Cutsman.
Again, not going to say anything about an opinion.
Like, I'm pretty sure the last thing you want is for someone to get bored while playing your game. I think that means you, what's the word? Oh yeah, completely fucking failed. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't want my games to be cyclical, reusive, flawed, sleep-inducing, boring, and revolting to even talk about playing, while trying to divert attention from the fact that they are all these things.
It is the last thing you would want. And anyone with a frontal lobe would agree with that statement. Getting bored while consuming content is a failure on the part of those making it, especially when it's shoddy and repetitive. I don't know, Caption, maybe you shouldn't be so hard on Borderlands 3. I don't want to mince words, but the short and long of it is you both seem to have a lot in common. Almost like you're twins, in fact.
By throwing thousands of dollars that could have been used to make the good at constant annoying dialogue.
What the fuck did you just say there? The good at constant dialogue. I honestly can't tell. And I cannot believe that instead of attacking the almost universally agreed mess that is Borderlands 3's story, you're going after its gameplay. Which surprisingly improves upon Borderlands 2 in many ways. Seems to me you're a little bit of a contrarian.
I don't know, maybe that's just me. Because this game is boring, and that's why. The only part of it that is any fun is the endgame. They clearly just didn't care about the most important part of the game. The enemies are bad, some of them have like one singular attack that is incredibly easily dealt with by jumping around, sometimes they just completely sit fucking still or don't move in a way that makes them hard or fun to shoot at all. Their abilities are often stolen by bosses, or vice versa. What abilities you can avoid, again, being avoided by jumping around haphazardly all willy-nilly because they're so poorly made that you can jump around and sort of avoid everything they do because the movement is shit, so there's nothing else you can do.
I'm just going to interrupt to say that you saying everything can be avoided by jumping and then dying because of it at 36:34 was really funny to me. I really needed that laugh. Thank you, Caption. After this, Caption here summarizes some previous points and that the game is boring before we move on to Mayhem Mode as a topic.
And before anyone says anything, yes, I obviously did try out Mayhem Mode, and we'll finally talk about it because it's our final topic. And yes, Mayhem Mode is actually the best part of the game, or rather, it's a part of the best part of the game. It's where all of the most efficient play of Borderlands 3 lies, in the endgame.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have a strange feeling that I will be agreeing with you for a short period of time.
However, I don't like this game, so I wasn't really excited about it.
Ah, there it is. The bias is admitted. I hate this game. Yet even I have positive things to say about it. It is possible to remain as unbiased as one can be when it comes to media consumption. It's especially useful when critiquing things, Caption, so you don't mislead anyone.
I like that it gives bosses enough health to be hard. It's where our hard mode is, it's where all of the most important times go. But it wasn't very exciting to just play the game in a way where everything takes 3 times as long to kill. Which of course it needs to do for any of the bosses to even subsist, because the characters get so incredibly broken and do so much damage as time goes on that it really just ends up being the default hard mode.
Agreed. Giving bosses more health is a good and bad thing, as it further brings out that some bosses are extremely lackluster. It can also make the game seem to drag on seamlessly.
I like it because it's hard mode, but I wish there were other things modified about the bosses, other than just how long they take to kill. I appreciate the existence of Mayhem mode, and it was the most enjoyable and interesting part of the game, or rather that the endgame of killing bosses for gear and making a character was, but it came in way too late, and it doesn't fundamentally change the game. It just makes all of the enemies take more damage, as I said, and gives you a couple of modifiers to care about.
Again, I agree here. Mayhem could have shooken things up by giving bosses more attacks or random kill conditions for a bonus reward. Perhaps there could be area modifiers that we'd have to play around. There was a lot of room for creativity, and it was severely underutilized. Here he talks about bosses slightly again and brings up the walking sideways thing, which we already went over.
And the thing that perplexes me is that I see so many people saying that this game is fun, that the gameplay is really good. And I don't get how. What about this was fun? What about this was fun? I actually don't get it.
Here we see a wild caption learn what subjectivity is for the first time. And you can see why the gameplay is the best part, comparing it to the story and seeing all the things they got right. And seeing all the things they improved upon since Borderlands 2. I'm just gonna let this next part play out.
Like, I watched what I guess is technically high-level Borderlands 3 play, and I use that term a little bit loosely here, and it's just people jumping and shooting. Or if you have a splatter gun build, you're sliding.
Have you guys guessed it yet? Specifically the phrase jumping and shooting, by the way.
This clip of Sin T beating the newest boss on the hardest difficulty without any help literally has him jumping from side to side. And yes, there is a little bit more to it than that. There's a matter of maintaining your momentum and things like that. And yes, I know what people are going to say, and I do appreciate the fact that there are free bosses coming out at all, even if it's in between purchasable DLC, but I just don't care.
You can take anything down to its simplest form by breaking it down. There is skill that is involved in soloing Wotan, and as you said, it is deeper than that. Citing this as a point of criticism is like me reviewing Smash Ultimate using a tournament clip and saying, I don't know why this is fun, they're just jumping and attacking. See, it's not valid. After that, Caption again finds out what subjectivity is.
There are some parts of that are fun, I will admit, but that's what the endgame of this is, grinding all the same bosses who make you jump to the side over and over again, getting legendaries. If the bosses were good and the game were more about this, and less about this, it might be good, but it wasn't.
Thank you for summarizing an RPG, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not here to be an asshole, but to offer valid criticism, and to point out the flaws within this video. I also wouldn't mind opening a dialogue with you, Caption, and I hope that your content improves and that you have great success on the platform. Genuinely, I mean that. I hope you all enjoyed this video and understand why I had to make this. Until next time.